A George W. Bush-appointed federal judge today issuing a scathing critique of Attorney General William Barr, and in so doing, demanding to see an unredacted version of the Mueller report. It goes back to William Barr's handling of the report in the weeks leading up to its public release. The AG's initial cherry-picked pro-Trump summary of its, quote, principal conclusions, and the spin job he did the morning the findings were shared publicly, aimed at preempting the report with so-called context like this.
President Trump faced an unprecedented situation. As he entered into office and sought to perform his responsibilities as president, federal agents and prosecutors were scrutinizing his conduct before and after taking office and the conduct of some of his associates. At the same time, there was relentless speculation in the news media about the president's personal culpability. Yet, as he said from the beginning, there was, in fact, no collusion.
Barr's poor widow president speech. The federal judge on that issuing criticism, saying that the differences between the Mueller report and the Attorney General's description of it there, quote, caused the court to seriously question whether Barr made a calculated attempt to influence public discourse about the Mueller report in favor of President Trump, despite certain findings in the redacted version of the report to the contrary. These circumstances generally and Barr's lack of candor specifically call into question Barr's credibility. A judge wrote that, one that George W. Bush picked. And for that reason, U.S. District Judge Reggie Walton is now ordering government lawyers to give him the complete report so he can evaluate whether the material was properly blacked out. Joining our conversation, editor-at-large for The Bulwark, Charlie Sykes, and the Rev Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC and president of the National Action Network. Wow.
No, actually, wow. When's the last time a federal judge rebuked the attorney general, basically saying, look, he lied to the public about something fundamental? This was a deeply dishonest presentation by William Barr. We knew it at the time. But again, we were talking about the stew of lies in your last segment. You know, Donald Trump has relied on this bodyguard of lies to protect him. And this is now the vulnerable point, because this judge is well respected. He is a senior judge. His words are going to be taken seriously in the legal community. And it's a real shot at this Justice Department, which is increasingly politicized.
Yeah.
I mean, since the acquittal in the Senate, you can see the Trump administration weaponizing this, Bill Barr pushing the limits. And so this has got to be kind of a brushback pitch from the federal judiciary.
I don't know Bill Barr, but I wondered after he did that. I mean, and what's surprising to me about Bill Barr, I worked in Republican politics for long enough to know the Bill Barr type. Yeah. And he seems so Hannity-ized. I mean, there are not a lot of people with Bill Barr's pedigree who act like Sean Hannity as head of the Justice Department.
Now, this is part of this process of the way Trump corrupts everything around him. You know, Rick Wilson says everything Trump touches dies, but it's more like the corruption. And so, you know, Bill Barr apparently, you know, has decided that he is going to be the Roy Cohn for Donald Trump.
Why?
But again, well, I think you go back into his record, you know, a long time. Maybe we shouldn't have been so surprised, because this is somebody who has this view of the unitary executive, all power to the executive. But also there is something about him that, you know, where he is willing to turn the position of attorney general into a servant of the president. This president, and quite frankly, look, you've been talking about the importance of credibility. You know, at a time like this administration, one lie after another, one attack on its credibility after another. And it is so fundamental that the Justice Department have some sense of or reputation for integrity. And this is a real shot.
This also isn't the first time in recent weeks that a federal judge in the District of D.C. has basically said, what the hell is going on in Main Justice? We had that happen only a few weeks ago with the Roger Stone sentencing situation, where DOJ prosecutors, including a senior person in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of D.C., had to go in front of Judge Amy Berman Jackson and basically say, sorry about the mix-up. We're having some major internal communication problems. And now, of course, we see Judge Walton saying that he just is no longer willing in every case to take DOJ litigators and prosecutors at face value in the comments that they make. And on top of that, he said several months ago in newly released court filings that the way Trump was handling the investigation of former FBI chief Andy McCabe basically made it look like the DOJ was part of a banana republic. To have multiple federal judges in arguably the most important district within the federal judiciary be that comfortable and open going after the DOJ, setting aside all the other impacts, that makes life a lot more complicated for the DOJ lawyers who have to go in there every day, build relationships, maintain credibility, and try to do their jobs.
I think that what is very important about this last judge and this Mueller report and the open rebuke of Barr is that not only is he a respected judge, he's a Bush-appointed judge.
Right.
I mean, we need to emphasize he is a Republican president's appointed judge. And to come on as strongly as he didn't leave any room there to misinterpret him, I think is a significant statement. And it really speaks to how Barr has, in a way, helped this president reinterpret what the presidency is all about. It is a real threat to how we are going to be in this country, even if Donald Trump is no longer president after the November election, in trying to realign what government is. Because if we start normalizing where the attorney general operates as the private attorney to the president rather than the head of the Justice Department for the people, and a Roy Cohen type of private lawyer at that, then we have the whole nation beginning to unravel and reinterpret what is the constitutional premise of how this government is set up. That's what's at stake here. This is bigger than Donald Trump and a distorted Mueller report. We're talking about speaking to the very fabric of this country.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.